Welcome to Transformational Psychology. My name is Ryan Holsapple. Today I have for you a great episode with the Anonymous Philosopher. He is a wonderful, brilliant man who prefers that his identity is not revealed publicly. So we went with the Anonymous Philosopher. This will be audio only. For those of you who listen on podcast audio only anyway, then it doesn't matter. For those of you on YouTube, next time we'll try to get you some video if that's what you're looking for. What are we going to cover today? Well, first, let me just tell you, this is not an episode for people who are looking for quick, practical, digestible, psychological advice. This is an episode for those who want more deep philosophy, who want to talk about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. We go far, we go deep, it gets heady. Now, one of the areas where we get bogged down is talking about values. And there's a way in which my approach to values is heavily impacted by my training with Dr. Roger Strachan. And that's a relativity problem with values. Every culture brings with it a different orientation towards what are the right customs, what are the wrong customs, what is our morality, how do we navigate the world ethically. There's variations. Now, there are some consistencies throughout different cultures, but there's also wide variations. And it's not that I'm proposing that values are relative and we should live in this postmodern universe where nothing means anything. That's actually not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is so much of what we ingest is given to us from culture as far as how we should or ought to live our lives. In Gestalt therapy, we call them introjects. Introjects are those voices, opinions, and styles of consciousness that we adopt through our socialization process. So this is what adults should do, right? This is how kids should behave. This is how boys should behave. This is how girls should behave. For example, we should go through school. Maybe you have a family that says you should go to college. And shoulds are fundamentally damaging to the soul, in my estimation, because the should actually come from within. What I want, what is authentic to me. The reason that we have socialization is so that we can get along and live together. But socialization is not the ultimate pinnacle for the individual's development. Socialization is only a part of individual development. After we become socialized and we learn how to live in a cohesive society and we make those personal sacrifices and agreements where I live within a value system that is socially contracted, then I have to then figure out who am I? And that's why Nietzsche talks about the three transformations of the spirit. You know, you have to go from the camel who carries a load, who becomes a societally acceptable individual, to the lion who slays the dragon thou shalt. And the dragon thou shalt is the introject. And then you become the child after the lion frees you up. And the child is the person who can live authentically from their being. And that's what we're going for in transformational psychology, in my view. We want to find a place of authenticity where we can live within a society if we choose to do so, but that we're not constrained absolutely by the dominating force of thou shalt. We feel like we have this authentic inner compass of our own values as an individual. And of course, we negotiate our own values with the values of others and with the values of our particular social construct and with the values of the greater whole. We have to exist as a harmony unless we want to go be a hermit and live on our own, which is okay too. So that's where I'm coming from. In no way do I want that to be interpreted as there are no such thing as values or we shouldn't have values. It's a problem of relativity, and it's a problem of the individual versus the society. And I am advocating that the individual discovers who they are. And I think where my discussion buddy is coming from as well is actually a pretty similar vantage point, but using different language and slightly different ideas when it comes to what he calls the good. See, and this is where we get bogged down, because when you use a word like the good, I start asking, well, who defines that? Who defines what's good? Is it you? Is it your social group? Is it your Bible? Who defines what's good? Well, as a student of Dr. Strachan, as a student of Carl Jung, I obviously feel that the good has to be defined inside. And I think my partner ultimately agrees with that. We just have slightly different ways of getting there. And if we get a little bogged down with that discussion about values, I apologize. And I hope that you can get through that, because I think there's a lot in here that's worth listening to. We do talk about Jung. We talk about Heidegger and phenomenology. We get into all sorts of really interesting things. So I hope that you can bear with us if we get a little bit bogged down. I will have him back on, and I will not get bogged down in that conversation about values, because I think there's a lot more that he has to offer that would have been available had I not pressed so hard on the value discussion. So I ask for your patience, I ask for your understanding, and I ask for your willingness to put up with that, because don't worry, I'll make it up to you. And I hope it's a diversion that's worth taking ultimately for the sake of education, learning, and potentially finding out whether you agree, disagree, or land somewhere in the middle on that particular line of thinking. Wow, I don't really think there's much else to say. This podcast was recorded a couple months ago, and one of the things that I share in this podcast is, I'm not going to read the comments anymore. I'm too sensitive to read comments. And that's how I felt in August. Now it's November. And it's because I got some nasty comments and on YouTube, and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore, because my temperament, I have a sensitive side that is genetically based, and if those of you who listen to my subpersonality lectures will understand, I had to face my sensitivity and be like, well, do I really want to expose myself to people who might target me? And a few months ago, my answer was, no, I don't. I don't want to expose myself. I'm not going to read the comments. But since then, I feel like I have family on YouTube. You know, there are a handful of listeners who have been with me for a long time, back from when I was on Sorting Myself Out, and some even before Sorting Myself Out. And so right now, I feel like I do want to read the comments. So just disregard my comments about not reading the comments, and just know that I'm in a process of discovery and change too. That's my authenticity. I'm constantly becoming. I'm constantly changing. I'm learning about myself every day. And what's true for me today might not be true for me tomorrow. And I reserve the right to change my mind about who I am and what I believe. And that's one of the things that Dr. Strachan has really hammered home for me. When you learn something about yourself or the world and you feel that it's true, grab onto it and believe it with all your heart. But as soon as you no longer feel that it is fitting for you, drop it like a hot potato. And be adaptable, be flexible, be able to grow. Don't get too stagnant and rigid when you have a system. And also don't get too loose and unwilling to adopt something if it works for you. So that's where I'm at. Thank you for allowing me to be authentic instead of having to edit that out of the conversation and then make it seem like I never said that, because I think it's better for everyone if I'm authentic. I think it sets a better example for others, and it sets a better example for myself, for how I want to live, for the integrity I want to have. And I will say that since that point, I've actually done a lot of work on my sensitivity. I've become more resilient. I've learned how to protect myself from the black hole, who is the personality inside of me that shames me and beats up on me. I've learned how to defend against him. I've learned how to tell him to go fuck himself and give the little boy and the sensitive feeler in me the love and the protection they need from the adult parts of who I am. And this kind of fragmented version of dealing with my subpersonalities is actually, ironically, what makes me most whole, is exploring these different parts of who I am and allowing them to express and come up with boundaries and negotiations inside of myself. So anyways, I'm ranting, I'm rambling. I've been doing this for 10 minutes. This is a longer podcast than the last couple, I believe, so I hope you enjoy a longer discussion, and have a wonderful holiday season if you are listening to this around the time of November 2020. And you can contact me by hitting on my website in the description or leaving a comment on YouTube, and I will try to respond if I can. All right. See ya. Welcome to Transformational Psychology. My name is Ryan Holsapple. I created this podcast because I believe that human beings have the capacity to transform and live deeply meaningful lives. My podcast is based on two pillars: education and transformation. The educational branch allows us to explore the cutting-edge psychology of transformation and many important theoretical ideas. Monologues, interviews with experts, and transformational concepts are presented for the audience to engage with and reflect on. I also believe it is of the utmost importance that people have practical transformational tools for making real-life changes. So this podcast still provides applicable and digestible guidance to complement the theoretical component. It is my hope that this podcast offers education and transformational guidance to a world that is seeking meaning and connection. Okay, we're good. Stoicism, you were saying. What about stoicism? Stoicism helps with stress.
Well, so really it's the connection between the basic idea that you can control very, very little, right? You can only really control your own emotional response to things, and even that is not entirely within your control. And so it's a lot like the Buddhist idea of I can't even remember what it's called. There's a technical term for it, but where you're not allowing outside influences to affect you. You're basically just allowing them to pass through you. And so it's what I did to avoid being stressed was I realized, I can't control about 90% of these things that are going on. I can't control politics. I can't control the nation's response to a pandemic. I can't even control the people who I work for and who work for me. I can't control their emotional responses to these things.
Right.
And the effort to do so was eating me alive.
Oh my God.
So I basically just had a moment where I sat down and said to myself, I could, if I wanted to, continue tilting at this particular windmill, or I could just remind myself that I'm not God.
Right.
I'm not in control of all this stuff.
Right.
And let it pass through. And that was a good call, I think.
That's amazing. No, I love that. It's so synchronistic because this morning, I don't know if you saw my Facebook post.
I did not. I was on only briefly. I don't spend too much time on Facebook.
Yeah, I don't either. I'm doing this new thing I call post and ghost.
Smart.
I post and I disappear because there's just too much going on. And with my sensitivity, it's just not worth the constant kind of feeling like, am I doing okay? Or, you know what I mean? It's like a self-care thing, it's like, I don't need to be using the internet as a way to evaluate, my own worth or anything like that. So as someone who's been creating content for a while, podcasts, all that stuff, I've had to learn that my constitution's a little more sensitive. So I need to be less committed to the whatever people are saying, positive or negative. And then I can trust my friends. And then I have some audience members who I'm close with to tell me like, hey, this is great, or, this is where you can improve, but it's coming from a different place.
Yeah, the internet is not a safe place.
No.
It's not a place where you can actually expect people to be honest or fair.
No.
So, yeah, it was a long time ago now, but I used to have a philosophy blog. Do you remember that? Were you ever
Well, we've talked about your philosophy blog, but it was before my own philosophical inception. So I don't think I read it.
It was long before like the advent of any of these like video things. But I managed to keep a really, really good sort of chat discussion going about these different ideas by putting a lot of energy into it. But if ever you get a troll who stumbles into it, they're not interested in truth, right? They're not looking for a real conversation. They're not interested in a rational, reasoned argument. They're just focused on their own purpose, which is basically to get your goat.
Exactly.
So a lot of what goes on online, I hold in very, very, very low regard.
Yeah.
If you want to try out a philosophical idea or a new theory, don't post it on the internet.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, make sure you're ready if you do, and yeah, for sure. Well, here's what I posted this morning because I think it's right in line with what you just shared. So I wrote, very early on in my sobriety, I had to learn how to turn my chaotic inner world over to a power greater than myself. This humbling step allowed a new force inside me to emerge, which was able to handle life on life's terms. Lately, I've been reflecting on the areas in my life where I'm grasping for control, even though I cannot have any. There are certain facts of my existence that must be surrendered and left to be handled by a different mode of being. My willful mind has no place banging his head against problems over which he is powerless. So today I am reminded of the humility it took me to get sober, and that this very same humility is what I need to overcome some of my daily neuroticism. And then, yeah, I know it's so in line. It's exactly what you were just sharing. And then I posted underneath it a quote from Carl Jung, where he says, in the end, quote, in the end, one has to admit that there are problems which one simply cannot solve on one's own resources. Such an admission, has the advantage of being honest, truthful, and in accord with reality. And this prepares the ground for a compensatory reaction from the collective unconscious, which is his whole thing that I can get into more. You are now more inclined to give heed to a helpful idea or intuition, or to notice thoughts which had not been allowed to voice themselves before. Perhaps you will pay attention to the dreams that visit you at such moments, or will reflect on certain inner or outer occurrences that take place just at this time. If you have an attitude of this kind, then the helpful powers slumbering in the deeper strata of man's nature can come awake and intervene. For helplessness and weakness are the eternal experience and the eternal problem of mankind. To this problem, there is also an eternal answer. Otherwise, it would have been all up with humanity long ago. When you have done everything that could possibly be done, the only thing that remains is what you could still do only if you knew it. But how much do we know of ourselves? Precious little, to judge by experience. Hence, there is still a great deal of room left for the unconscious. Prayer, as we know, calls for a very similar attitude and therefore has much the same effect.
Yeah, that's great.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, it really is. No, it occurs to me, because I don't know very much about Jung's, I know a little bit about his theory. I know about the collective unconscious and that. Was he religious in any way? Was he like he feels to me a bit like a Hindu, but.
Well, what the way he would put it, I think, is that the psyche is religious, that, irrespective of what's objectively true, it remains a fact phenomenologically that humans have a religious component of mind. And because of that fact, it would be foolish to ignore that part of us. It would be like, trying to swim upstream.
or resisting reality. But the reality is that we do have a very religious or spiritual component to our psyche, most human beings. So he would say that that's what's important, to know that as a fact, regardless of whatever is metaphysically true.
Yeah.
And then to act accordingly. Like, so for him, prayer or religious practice was a matter of practicality just as much as anything else.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I wouldn't call him a Hindu, though. I mean, he actually criticized people who turned to different cultures for religious insight quite a bit, because he believed that there was something in your ancestry that was important, and that to kind of like uplift yourself and transport yourself over to another culture could be not damaging, but could be like very ungrounding. And to him, if you have a background in Christianity, it's better to first look there and see if that helps than to look in other places. But for certain people, he understood that going into religious institutions wasn't a viable option. So he had other therapeutic methods that he would suggest. But he did draw from Hinduism. That's where he got his theory of the self, partly, which believes that in the wholeness of who we are, basically. So he was a complicated thinker. I would say he definitely had a lot of inspiration from those Eastern religions, but he was very careful about not using that as a crutch or something to lean on. Yeah. And he references, Judeo-Christian thinking perhaps probably far more than Eastern thinking.
Yeah, very interesting. And he's such an interesting guy. Like his ideas are just really, really interesting. It's always kind of fun to sort of trace the roots back. Where does this come from? Where does that other idea lead?
Yeah, and I don't know if all Jungians would agree with how I just represented that. That's just my take from what I've been able to gather in these years of studying Jung. But he's a very, very interesting thinker. Because on some level he's talking biology, right? He's talking collective unconscious as kind of a phylogenetic shared reality. And then on another level, he's talking, some people interpret him metaphysically. Some people take archetype and they think, this is like an energy, or this is, and that's been criticized. It's all up for interpretation, but that's been criticized as not what he was trying to say. But he did have this very mystical edge to him. So it's not. So it's like, I think my take on it, he wanted so badly to be seen as a scientist by his peers, and it really pissed him off to be called a mystic. Right. And so he was like, no, like I'm talking about stuff like phenomenology. It's directly empirically observable, and it exists ubiquitously. And I'm not talking about metaphysics. I'm not talking about the thing in of itself, right? I'm talking about, what we're experiencing.
Yeah.
So,
well, I was thinking the way you described it, I was going to suggest that sounds transcendental, but I wonder if it might be better to think of it as being sort of subscendental, right? So it's not more than the human nature, it's underlying human nature.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's why it's called depth psychology, right?
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And even a common criticism in depth psychology is that we are far too obsessed with transcendence and could use a bit more understanding of what it is to be in a body and why we're here. And so there's a bit of a criticism there that until we fully accept the body, like the idea of the spirit isn't able to be inculcated. It's not able to be fully realized or learned, because we're still bypassing the first lesson, which is that we're here in a body. Right. So
it's hard to do much if you can't live in the now.
Right. But you see, this is interesting too, because even in Jungian thought, saying spirit is just as much a psychological word as it is a potential metaphysical thing. So you see, you know, like how
you gotta parse that for me. I don't understand.
So you know how Immanuel Kant developed the idea that you can't know the thing in itself?
Yes.
Das in sich or something. I don't know how to say it, but something like that.
Yes.
And that because of you're in a body and you have a particular mind with a particular set of perceptual and behavioral circuits, everything you experience is through that filter. So you're never contacting direct reality in that Kantian. So Jung maintains that Kantian distinction throughout his writing. So my understanding was saying is like, okay, so the spirit, like spirituality or spirits, plural, or entities or whatever you want to call it. It's like, okay, so yeah, they might exist, but they definitely exist in the mind. They definitely exist for us as a psychological experience that we have these spiritual. So that's all he's saying.
So on some level, they are definitely real.
Right. That's all he's saying. He's being a phenomenologist. That's what he's doing.
That's cool.
But back to Stoicism, because I didn't want to get too far from that. The reason I shared that quote is because it was so synchronicity is another principle Jung came up with. It's when outer events correspond with inner experiences, right? So here I am this morning, I wrote that big post, and I haven't been posting a lot lately. And then you contact me shortly after I post it and say, let's talk. The first thing we talk about is, I'm really letting go of control. And that's before we get back to Stoicism, that's the other thing about Jung that was interesting, because he had this belief in synchronicity, right? Which implies that somehow inner experiences correspond with the outer world.
Yes.
So he's kind of pushing the edge there. But just this kind of experience kind of confirms that there are times, whether it's, just a coincidence that's serendipitous, or whether there's some sort of cosmic order, there are times when stuff like this happens where you think, wow, like that is just uncanny.
Yeah. I tend to think of my way of saying that is that you have these moments of inspiration. And if you leave yourself open to the moment and you follow where the inspiration leads you, you end up with these marvelous, let's call them coincidences, right? Mm-hmm. Whether they're actually coincidences or not is a secondary question, right? And I think that Jung I think he's probably onto something. There's this level that connects us all, this interwoven consciousness that we're all we're perceiving in different ways. And some of us are more perceptive to it or more open to it. And you can probably close yourself completely off to it if you try hard enough, but completely maybe not. But so I think that there's definitely something my life experience would be there's too many of these coincidences that I can't possibly explain.
I feel the same way. I feel that there is just so much we don't know about the universe, and that as much I'm a big believer in science, but as much as I think science is valuable, it has yet to explain some of those more meaningful components of existence. And even furthermore, there's a lot of people who discount those meaningful components as unreal or because you can't measure it in the same way, it's not valuable. But no, it's deeply, think about how meaningful it is to have an experience like that, and to say that it, because it can't be quantified or if it can't be tested properly, that means it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, and acknowledging there are boundaries on, let's call them the physical sciences, is not to diminish the physical sciences. They have a great role to play. They do wonderful things, and they're super interesting. Science has a lot to teach all of us, but science can never answer questions which go beyond science. And frankly, there are whole vast swaths of real sciences, philosophy, theology, even some elements of psychology, which are just, they go beyond what a material scientist would be able to say or do. And it's just, I don't think acknowledging that diminishes them at all. It's just honestly acknowledging the limitations of that field. You wouldn't expect a chemist to weigh in on a psychology question unless there's a chemical interaction, right?
Right.
It's a limitation. And culturally, we've grown up in a world where that is really discounted. And that is to all of our detriment, is that this idea that what you can see and touch and feel is real, and it's all that's real, is pervasive. It's everywhere. And so people end up with these really, really strange ideas, and they don't, like that Kantian idea that you can never truly encounter the other thing is profoundly important, right? Knowing that your scientific experiment, you're not actually interacting with the thing itself, you're interacting with a representation of it.
Right.
And it's always going to be at least one remove, and usually 4 or 5 removes.
Right.
Just based on how we perceive things.
Right.
So
that's beautifully put. And I noticed in your response, you broadened the definition of science significantly. Can you tell me more about that?
What do you mean?
I'm so used to science, and this is just probably a limitation of my education, being defined as that physical side of things these days, right? So, but you even include theology in your, so tell me more about what you mean by science being so broadly defined.
Well, yeah, so it's a modern change to have science be limited to these physical sciences. It's well, as a classicist, it's a really weird extrusion of, it's a weird thing that people have done. But traditionally, if you go back beyond, let's call it the Enlightenment era, all things which were considered to be following the laws of reason were considered to be scientific. Science is following reason, right? And that all goes back to anything which is reasonable and can be founded on logical principles and which is logically internally consistent, therefore is a science. You can study it scientifically, not according to the modern scientific method, because that's physical sciences. But you can put Jung's ideas to the test, right? You just can't do it necessarily. You can't identify the collective unconscious with a spectral microscope, right? It's just not, the spectrographic analysis of the collective unconscious comes up wood, right? It doesn't get you anywhere.
Right.
Which is not to say that these other things aren't scientific. That really is it's very modern. And I think it's just the last 200 years. My dad would be able to give you a better, he's really studied the history of knowledge more than I have. I bet he could actually pinpoint, I'm going to bet he would pinpoint Descartes, but that's just a guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of Descartes, we were going to bring up Heidegger in this discussion.
Yeah.
Heidegger was basically, in Being in Time, my reading on it was trying to say that subject-object delineation is not all-encompassing as far as how we experience life. It's not actually true on the most meta level. It's only one way of thinking of things, separating subject and object.
Can you explain that? Because I got really bogged down, and I tried to make sense of it, and I tried to build I tried to build the house that Heidegger lived in, and I was not able to do that.
Yeah.
So when you say that subject and object are not valid distinctions, what do you mean?
Well,
What is your thought on that?
Well, I should just preface this with a couple things. First of all, Heidegger's a really complicated writer, wrote a lot of different stuff, and I'm not an authority, but I have read Being in Time and some of his other stuff, and so I've got some thoughts of my own on it. What my take on it is that he was saying that because of Descartes' Cartesian dualism, it created this Western mindset where the subject, the human being, was separated from the world. So no longer is it like I'm in a larger body of the earth, I'm in this experience of being, where actually the world is being with me, I'm being in it, to I'm being, and then there's the world. And so there's subjects, there's subjective, and then there's objective. So there's personal, and then there's what's really going on. And it privileges this kind of perspective of scientific objectivism that we have now today, that takes a step back and looks at this water bottle, for example, and looks at it objectively. Like, what is it made of? What are its particles? What's its volume? Whatever it would be. And Heidegger's argument is that, yeah, that's one mode of consciousness. That's a scientific mode of consciousness or perception, but that is not the primary mode of being in day-to-day life. We don't experience everyday life that way. When you're drinking out of this water bottle, you're not thinking about it objectively. It's actually a part of your phenomenological environment. It's actually kind of an extension of your body.
And it becomes that literally, right?
Right. Exactly. And so you don't look at it as some object that's separate from you. You look at it, you don't even think about it. You just pick it up. You don't question it. It's not like you're not super aware of its objective presence. It's just all a part of that phenomenological field. And so I think part of what he's doing is saying, okay, so it's not just the body and then the world. It's like the body extends into the world in a very important way. And I think that's part of what his criticism was that you can't actually live in a world that Descartes is presenting. It's not actually the world we live in. It's a way of thinking about material, but we don't really perceive things in an objective way. It's always coming through in this greater context of meaning, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And he came up with what he calls modes of attunement, right? So if you're scared, your environment means something totally different to you than if you're horny. You know what I mean? Like, or if you're hungry, or if you're angry. So it's like whatever experience you're having, your environment's going to have different salient features that get magnified. And then your environment technically changes phenomenologically. So right now, you and I are having a friendly conversation, but if one of us gets angry, I'm going to notice totally different salient facts about my existence. What's in the room, what I'm aware of, what's valuable, what I should avoid, what I should move towards. It all changes on the basis of attunement. What is my mode of being? And so I guess you could say this Cartesian mode of being is saying, I want this objective awareness. I want this, it's kind of a scientific consciousness, but that's just one mode of attunement among many others that we experience as humans.
Well, and that ties back to the Kantian idea, because you can never really encounter something in that way, not truly, right? Yeah. It always has to exist as a representation in the mind, or as an object which you are interacting with it.
Right.
To reduce it purely to its scientific characteristics is to deny its actual reality in a meaningful way. Like it becomes just atoms.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And atoms are not going to be something which, if you were to get down to that level, it's no longer a water bottle.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. It's not a water bottle anymore. It's something else entirely. It has no meaning in our psychological field.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think he's doing a valuable piece of work there on our history, philosophically and scientifically. But to your point, I mean, it's very difficult it's not, the language he uses to express these ideas is not always pleasant. Like you said about the continental philosophers, to me in a different conversation, is they have a tendency to make things far more dry than they need to. They could say it in different ways.
Yeah, I've had this sort of internal joke about them for a while, which is that they're people, they read to me like people who are trying to look really, really cool to 4 other people on the planet. And so they're trying to write something which only those 4 people can understand, and no one else, it's not accessible to anyone else.
It's a bit arrogant.
Then somehow they're in the elite.
Yeah.
But my whole approach is totally opposed to that. I think that the real master of his knowledge is the one who's able to take that really complicated idea and make it real to anybody. Right? It doesn't have to be hidden behind 15 layers of secrecy.
Right.
We're not Gnostics. We're trying to bring it out to people.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, I mean, people like Nietzsche might have a disagreement with you there, because he was such an elitist. He might have thought, and I don't mean that in a Nazi sense, but he was an intellectual
Had to bring Nazis in, didn't you?
Well, he was an elitist in the sense that, in my interpretation of Nietzsche, which is limited, in the sense of being the Übermensch, being the overman. It's not for the faint of heart, and he almost, I almost sensed he had somewhat of a contempt for the average person.
I think that's fair. Yes.
So that's my point, is that he was more about like being excellent. I don't think he was interested in appealing to the masses in any way. At least that's my take. I mean, could be totally off base.
Well, and I think you do him a little bit of a disservice there, because I do think what he was trying to do is he's trying to call us all to be Übermensch, right?
You think so?
Trying to rouse in all of us that desire to be greater.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But you're not that far off. I'm not disagreeing with 90% of what you just said. I just think let's do fairness to the dead, right? So
no, and like I said, I don't think I've read enough Nietzsche to say it with confidence. It's I'm not quite there yet to be able. So I appreciate the critique.
Well, and my personal experience would align very closely with what you just said. But I know enough people, and I've talked to enough people about Nietzsche, that I think that my representation of him and my perception of him is not entirely fair. I'm incredibly critical. He's one of the worst in my mind. But,
why? Tell me more. What's up with with that?
This whole idea that it's so self-aggrandizing, right? Is that you become the source of all meaning and purpose.
Right.
To me, that's his basic idea, is that you can create meaning and purpose for yourself, because you're not finding it anywhere else, buddy. So man up. And I just think that is so narrow and flawed that it appeals to all the worst characteristics in myself. My hubris, my pride, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it comes from a little bit of nihilism, though, because it does. He's saying, well, there is no objective meaning. There is no, meaning isn't out there. It's all, made up. And since God is dead, to quote Nietzsche, since religion is going down the toilet, it's up to us to figure this one out. But the idea that you can create your own values is really, well, let's just take it from it's not biological. It goes a little bit against biology, first of all, because you already have a set of a priori values from the moment you're born. I mean, you want to drink water, right? You want to eat, you want to find a mate eventually. There's a lot of values that we have that are very intrinsic. Even psychologically, we now have evidence that there's a lot of genetic interplay when it comes to personality and what makes people different, what gives people motivation. So yeah, I mean, the idea is questionable that you could create your own, just even from a hard science perspective. Well, and let alone from a more philosophical perspective.
Yeah, so for me, the issue is always that if you ever reach the point where you're considering the idea that truth is relative, right? If truth is not capital T truth, always true in every situation, if there is no such thing as that, then your preposition that there is no truth is itself untrue by definition, right? Right,
because you're saying that it's true that there's no truth.
Right. Your argument logically eats itself immediately, right? And so he can't be right. He can't be totally right there.
No.
No. Not to totally discount him, though, right? So there is something to the idea that you should drive yourself to rise above. Yeah. But I think his concept of what above is would not jive with my concept of above, right?
Right. Yeah. What's your concept of above? And I just want to mention before you answer that, I think I'm a little out of my depth with being able to give a fair critique to Nietzsche. So for anybody who listens to this, just take it with a grain of salt, because I need to do more research. And when I really know what I'm talking about, then I'm cool and I don't need to preface it, but I like to have enough strive to have humility, which is important to me, because I don't want to be intellectually fallacious.
Well, but you have an idea, and talking about your idea is how you build upon it, right?
Yes.
So that's the value of discussion. So don't undersell yourself either.
No, you're right. You're right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But so your question was, can you reframe the question? I got distracted. I wanted to build you up a little. You didn't undersell.
Thank you. Thanks. So what about like you said, you don't jive with the way he's getting to his higher values. How do you get to your higher values in your own philosophy?
Yeah. So for me, well, so if I'm speaking for me, not really speaking for any branch of philosophy, right? I pull from different areas to defend this idea, but I would say that the purpose of human life is happiness, and happiness is achieved through goodness. And you spend your whole life, if you are truly trying to do this, to find ways to be good. And you're going to discover, if you genuinely dedicate yourself to this, there's a whole host of intellectual challenges you're going to have to overcome, right? Mm-hmm. Defining what goodness is not an easy thing. And I'm not going to, because you're recording this, I'm not going to pretend that that I have the master key to that, right? Yeah. I could tell you what I perceive that to be, but I don't know that that's, like, I don't know that I could withstand formidable assault from every quarter on that. Mm-hmm. However, I do think that being open to that assault is part of what helps me reflect and become better, right? To reach for more goodness. And so if you were to argue, let's say we were to pick a particular value, let's pick a traditional virtue like courage, right? So if we're arguing about how courage plays out in day-to-day life, and we're talking about the courage it takes to argue with your friends, let's say, right, on something which they're really passionate about, and I'm saying, well, no, that's just you causing trouble, and you challenge me on it and help me to recognize, oh no, there's real courage in that, to stand up and say what is right, true and right and good and just is good. So mm-hmm. That challenging, I think, is important to helping you develop your goodness, is to be open about it, to talk about it, to read about it. But if I'm right, the purpose of human life is happiness. Happiness is achieved through goodness, and goodness is best defined by virtues. And I fall back on the classical virtues because I'm a classicist. But
and what are some of those classical virtues?
Oh, so if you go with the, see if I can do this off the top of my head. So it's fortitude, which is basically courage. It's chastity. Now I can't do it off the top of my head. There's 4 traditional virtues known by most, and then there's the 3 theological virtues, which are hope, faith, and love. I have those ones.
Yes.
Fortitude, temperance. Oh, I'm blanking on.
No problem. So I think that there might be a bit of a language barrier there for me, psychologically, and maybe we can get somewhere with this. I struggle with the good-bad dichotomy. One of the reasons I struggle with it is to the extent from which it is culturally designated, which actually creates standards, normative standards that are different cross-culturally. For example, Muslim culture is going to be a little different than our society, or on and on and on. Our society is going to have different values than an indigenous tribe living in New Zealand or somewhere in Australia. So there's all of those layers of cultural relativism that makes it difficult for me to nestle authority within any designated value statement about good or bad. And I think my ultimate issue with it is that you have to assume the authority. And then you have to eventually say, well, my God is the right God, and my values are the right values. And so there's an inescapable leap of faith that you have to make that I can't get there. And furthermore, the other issue that I struggle with it is that I think a lot of our cultural designations actually need to be thrown off through the process of self-development. Like if I am an adult and I'm still carrying around good boy, bad boy, and shame and blame, and I do this, I'm good, I do this, I'm bad. I'm still carrying around that socialization. I haven't really found any authentic source of soul or way of valuing myself. I feel like I'm just living in this kind of shadow of the past. And so that's kind of my struggle. But what the sense that I get when I hear you talk is that you have a phenomenological relationship to this idea that isn't what I'm saying, that
Yes.
is different. But that's my concern about those ideas.
Yeah, and that's a valid concern. But I think it comes down to the language, right? So because of the limitations of the language we're using, if we were having a real honest to goodness debate, we'd want to carefully define each of these things as we go through. So the concern is, I'd say, a normal one. That's a concern I would expect anytime I present that position. But I don't think that the idea that, well, a couple of things. So the first one is, I think that people present the differences between cultures on sort of, let's say, on virtue terms, let's use that virtue idea, are not as different as people think, right? There are parallels and similarities between the vast majority. And if you think about it, going back to that idea of science, so this is being what is reasonable and rational, to have a value that is totally opposed to one another is not actually possible, right? So we see it this way, because this is how we tend to, you have one perspective, I have one perspective, we come together, we talk about it. But what's actually happening, and I don't know if I can do this for the camera, is that we're both traveling in the same direction, and we're coming closer and closer together, right? It's only because we're looking at it from a second dimension, two-dimensional thinking, that we can't actually step up and see how we're actually both paralleling and coming closer and closer as we get further into the idea. So if you pick up individual little pieces, and we can pick on women's rights, for example, because there's easy to cast differences there. As a Western culture, we have a particular perspective on the rights of women. Mm-hmm. However, different cultures, let's say historically, let's not even pick on any current culture, have not held that, even our own culture hasn't held that in as high regard.
Yes.
That does not mean that every aspect of what they were doing is wrong. And even some of the ways which they express that would have elements of goodness in it. So I tend to think there's the possibility of approaching a better and clearer and further understanding, which is why I think having that sort of openness to be challenged on those ideas is vital. Because as you raise a point which is not totally in keeping with my own, it helps me to better challenge my own idea and step forward. And so I think the problem that people get into is they tend to think, I have arrived, right? They think I did A, B, and C and I'm done. I finally get to cash in my check and go home. But that's not what I'm talking about. This is what I'm saying is that this is a eternal process. As in it will go beyond your own lifespan. You will not arrive in the course of your life. There's no way to do that. You require eternity to do it. And so I'm very, very comfortable with those challenges of cultural relativism, right? I think those concerns are very, very valid. The way that someone articulates something in 300 BC does not necessarily mean that that is the end all be all. But I would say just because it was said in 300 BC doesn't mean we discard it, right? So you have to hold cultures as all seeking that goodness and all seeking that truth.
Right. Yeah, I like the framework of seeking truth. And I struggle with the using goodness as and I really do get that goodness and happiness are words that meant something very different in Greek thought than they do now. And I get that. And I think that's important for me to mention. What I really focus on, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm just right. It's very dangerous because people think happiness right now means physically pleasant. And that's not what I'm talking about at all, right? This goes back to that idea of stoicism we were talking about earlier, right? Yeah. You can be very happy in incredibly distressing circumstances, right? Happiness is not a function of of how pleasant something feels, right? So it's that's a very, very, very good point. The meaning of the terms I'm using are old. I'm using them in a Greek sense.
Yeah, like a Aristotelian and Platonic.
Yes.
The good, right?
Yes.
That's an Aristotelian idea. Am I correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So let me share a little bit about where I'm coming from and see if we can see where differences or similarities come out. What I'm all about is authenticity. And so for me, rather than the good, it's about, well, what's authentic? Like what is it about my expression as a being that is most authentic? And if that just so happens to line up with whatever you would call good, then fine. But it's not done from this derivative of good or bad. It's done out of this looking within and having a connection to a power greater than myself, something awe-inspiring, like you could call it the universe, you could call it God, you call it whatever you want, just something greater than just little old me. And then what is authentic to me? And I don't look at it from good or bad, right? Like I don't see the grizzly bear who eats his kids, which male grizzly bears do, as a bad grizzly bear because he's going against my values, or just because it's not authentic to me to eat my children. But in order to get where I'm coming from, it's difficult because I kind of discard cultural values. I just say, like, if it's your truth to be a serial killer, then that's your truth. I might stand in your way because that's not cool with me. That's not authentic to me. I'm going to do everything I can to stop that murder from happening. But not because I know that it's right or wrong, but because of authenticity, because of the generative spirit that I'm connected to as an individual. So I'm more individualistic unless I don't derive values from culture in as much as some other people do. I mean, obviously it's like water to fish, right? Like how could you say that? But to some extent, I feel like some of the most transformational things I've done in my life is to say, wow, like that's what society's saying. That's what they're saying. Like what's true for me? If I really dig down into my consciousness, and if going back to like a biblical analogy or metaphor, if we're all created in the image of God, then why not look within myself to find what it is that I am?
Yeah, but I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
No, but right. So this goes back to the idea that certain of these things are scientific, right? Because if it's reasonable and you can build a reasoned structure for it, then you're beginning the science. But so I think there's a level of, let's call it semantics at play. Yeah. And I'm not saying that that's unimportant, but I'm saying that it's important to recognize, because when you use the word authentic as opposed to good or bad. And you notice I actually don't use the term bad. Bad isn't quite the way I don't think of things in terms of bad. I think of things in terms of good.
It's so interesting because the word good conjures up the word bad for me.
And it doesn't for me, right?
Because it's like, I hear you. I'm just saying
so for me, goodness is like gravity, right? You're drawn towards the goodness.
Right.
You can't really be drawn towards the badness. It doesn't work. And so when you say something is authentic, what you're saying is very similar to what I'm saying. We're just using different terminology.
Well, that's why I said in the beginning, this might be a language barrier.
Yeah, I really think that it is. And I feel like I could, if pushed, force you into a logical series of steps that would force you to say that being inauthentic was bad. Right? Right?
So all I would say is it's certainly not authentic.
Well, that's tautology. So yes, that is correct.
Right. I hear you though.
But
Yeah,
it's
I have a lot of. Go ahead, please. I want you to finish.
no. I was gonna really. I feel like that you're not saying anything which is fundamentally different. And if we really wanted to sit down and honestly, it would be we'd be talking for weeks, which I have no
Right.
problem with. That'd be great.
Right.
We would end up discovering through those conversations that we're building a common language, which would then be just what we would adopt when talking to one another.
Yeah.
And then we would just slip past these types of problems and get closer to the essence of things. Language is a problem for us.
Right. Yeah. And I'm also aware that what I'm saying has some correspondence with that Nietzschean idea of creating your own values. But the difference for me that I would like to separate myself from that idea a little bit is that it's not so much creating them, it's looking within. It's discovering. Yeah. It's
yes.
not like a process of, yes, it's a creative process, but it's not de novo creation, right? It's not just out of nothing. It's a process of self-discovery.
But so then from your perspective, what I'm calling values would be, your values would be inherent to you.
Yes. And I don't impose them on other people as a practice, not as a perfection thing that I am good at necessarily, but something I practice is, okay, like this is what's real for me. I'm allowed to communicate those expectations. I'm allowed to ask for what I value. I'm allowed to have that view in the world. And then other people are certainly allowed to have the same process. So, but that's the difficulty people have with that. And my friend asked me the other day, so are you saying that, a rapist or a murderer isn't bad? Right? Are you saying a rapist or a murderer? And I said, I can't define that from a ultimate view of like a God's eye view. I can't say that. I can say it's not authentic to me. And I could say, you're damn right. If I saw it happening, I would be ready to fight. I would view a violent response of defense to protect that person who is being victimized as the right thing to do. I might even say, let's put this person in prison for life or whatever it would be, and penalize them for what they've done so that they can never do it again. There might be many things that I impose upon that person, but I'm not imposing it from an objective standpoint of claiming a God's eye view. I'm just saying, I am willfully interacting with the world from a perspective, and that's authentic to me. Now, you have every right to interfere with that if that's authentic to you, but we might clash.
Well, and so just to tie you down with cultural ties for a moment,
Please.
that is the value of non-judgment, right?
Yeah.
Which is Buddhist,
right?
And it's also Christian, right? It's the idea that judge not lest ye shall be judged, right?
I am on board with that 100%.
And so I think that those...
But I don't agree with it because it's Christian. I agree with it because it's authentic. You see what I'm doing here?
I see exactly what you're doing here. Nice little play there. Nice semantic effort. Right. You're not getting out of this. I warned you I was building an argument.
No, please. This is fun.
But the fact that those things are things which you're categorizing as being authentic.
Yeah.
And I'm saying those things are good.
Mm-hmm.
Just okay. We're making mouth noises, right?
So we're using the same framework. We're on the same page.
And very, very likely language. That if we keep delving into this idea, we will find differences, right? There'll be areas where you and I diverge, for sure. I don't disagree with what you said about the murderer and the rapist. I feel similarly, right?
Yeah.
And we could get into arguing about societal ethics and things like that, and legal ethics, which are slightly different things. But totally on a personal level, I think that your perspective is very, very, very reasonable and well-grounded.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and I'm not in any way condoning that behavior. I'm saying I disagree with it, but I'm just not nestling my claim in some authority that I don't possess. Yes.
But that's the acknowledgement that you are not the pinnacle of all truth. This is anti-Nietzschean, right?
Exactly. That's right. I don't know. I don't know. And but that doesn't mean I don't have the free will or the choice to interact with it in a specific way, right?
Yes.
And I may or may not agree with how I handled it 2 weeks from now, but you
Right.
know,
And
I
you,
do
you
what I
may
do in the
discover
moment.
later on that your whole approach today is entirely wrong.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Right. Well, not
I don't
wrong.
think you will, but you might.
Right. Right.
This particular example is not a good one for that, but
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's the idea of having a purely codified sense of ethics is very, very problematic. Because when I talk to college students about ethics, I always give them the example from it's the classical example of the man stealing bread to save his family.
Mm-hmm.
But stealing is wrong, right? But letting your family starve is wrong. And so
Logic 101, right? Like, yeah.
yeah,
You go
right?
back to the relativity of certain
Yes.
statements. Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
so
That's beautiful.
it's fun.
But what that brings me to is this place of guidance, like finding that inner compass, right? To be able to make these decisions on an intuitive basis rather than strictly thinking it through and just saying, well, you know, this is right, this is wrong. But eventually you have to come to a choice, and that kind of requires a trust inside of yourself, right? That there is something in me that I can rely on. Whether you call, I like to call it the soul. That's what I like to call it. My soul.
Sure.
That's connected to something greater.
That would be a classical way to define it.
Yeah. No, but that's really, I really like that way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, hang on. So because I really do, I have a specific purpose for wanting to chat with you. So,
Yeah.
so I'm going to bring us back around to Heidegger because I am unsatisfied with my understanding. So here's what I got out of Heidegger in my effort.
Sure.
Was that it's being in time. So the major question which he's trying to address is the nature of being itself, right? So that's the question that he's framing. And I got to the point where became clear to me that what he was trying to do is make it obvious that the best way to approach that question was to ask was to say that the mode of being which is most accessible to us is obviously the human mode of existence, right? The mode of a rational human being existing in the world. That's about as far as I got. I don't know where he goes from there. I got completely bogged down after that point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what he calls Dasein, right? He won't even use the word human being because he's really trying to get us to think about it in a totally different way. But whatever this experience is that we're having, this being there is Dasein, right? That just being there, thrown into this moment. He calls it being thrown as well. You just appear to yourself as here in the moment, and you're just kind of thrown into this existence, and all of a sudden you find yourself just coping with everyday existence, basically. And I think what he's trying to get at is there's these levels of awareness and unawareness that we're constantly oscillating in and out of. But because Dasein is so involved with everyday coping, just taking care of things, you know, getting to work, getting fed, relationship, constantly taking care, you get so immersed in your everydayness that you don't actually come back to this reflection on what's even happening here. So you're just thrown, basically, is what he said. You're just thrown into it. You don't even notice it half the time. It's most of the time. And then what he's saying is to live. Actually, he talks about living authentically. To live authentically, you come back to the moment and notice that you're being thrown, and you're being thrown into what he calls the they, what they are doing, and what it's like this kind of social construct that kind of floats around, and it just like it's this incessant societal chatter, and everybody just is stuck in it perpetually. And to live authentically, you kind of step back from the they, and you look at your life and you think, well, what is it that I'd like to contribute, or what would I like to do? Or it's a meaningful question, right? So he's kind of bringing us to an awareness of the predicament of being human, and living in ignorance versus living in some sort of conscious intention. But it's weird though, because he doesn't write as if the they is worse off than any other way of being. He just writes about it as a matter of fact. So I don't get the sense that he's saying you should do something. I think he's just pointing to what is. It's very complicated, honestly, and it's like I'm just picking at random here with different ideas, but yeah, I don't know what that generates for you.
Well, and so one of the things which I find really challenging about the whole question is that I am deeply ingrained in a Neoplatonic understanding of phenomenology, right? I've studied that for so long that it became second nature to me. And if you think of the Neoplatonics, the being is one of the triad, right? So the divine process of generation for the universe is the one, which in sort of traditional Christian terms, is you think of as God. You have the logos, which is the divine reason, and you have being, right? Which comes out, each one of these proceeds from the other. And so logos is trying to be like the one and generates the world of ideas.
Right.
Being is trying to be like the logos and generates the world of being. Mm. And so it's just a very different.
Yeah, I don't even think
he's
going back to fundamental ontology. I don't think he's not building off of
any of that. No, and
he's undercutting all of it and he's kind of almost starting over.
Yeah.
And saying we've created all these what he calls free floating ideas that have taken on a life of their own in philosophy, but aren't actually grounded in basic phenomenology. Saying, well, so let's start. And I don't actually think I think he uses some things from Aristotle and others, but I think he's using it and then starting into something new with it. So, but what I think is happening is you're trying to compare apples and oranges, perhaps. I think it's kind of futile. It's like they're just not the same.
Yeah, and I find this to be really challenging because I think of ideas as growing like a tree, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's a thread of thought that goes up, and over the years it branches and develops and goes further and further out, and right, the goal is to approach infinity, right? And when these people stop and start over, it's not that I can't say that he's wrong. I can't properly comprehend him. I just don't.
Yeah.
And I find his writing to be so inaccessible that and possibly it's because of my own preconception here, right? So if I didn't have this deeply ingrained belief that knowledge is, if you want to use the word progressive, right? As in it builds upon itself and moves further, I might have an easier time with people like him and like Nietzsche. It's just.
You think Nietzsche kind of does the similar thing?
In his own way, yes. But he was a classicist. He really was. He was deeply read. He read Plotinus but Heidegger read Plato, of course. Everyone read Plato. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think just one thing that's helpful for me is to separate phenomenology a little bit from these other branches of philosophy and metaphysics, and just think about it as all he's trying to do, what he's trying to do is talk about the experience of being. He's not looking at, he's not looking at abstract ideas or forms or truths. He's just saying, here we are. What is it like? What does it mean? Here we are. What does it mean? And that's it. And I think he's building a whole argument just on that awareness. And he's just making those observations and using his own logical style to say, if we just went with what we know as we can observe from experience, then what would we be left with as a fundamental truth? And that what he comes to, I think the conclusion he comes to is that we are time. Dasein is time. And Dasein, he says, yeah, we're not the past, because the past is non-existent, because
past is dead.
It only exists abstractly. We're not the future, and we're not the present, because in the present you're always moving towards a future and living out of a past, and in the future you're not there yet. You're all three of them at once. And so he says the future, time temporalizes itself out of the future, but you are time. That's his
that's going to take some thinking. That's
oh my God. It was very difficult to even understand what he was trying to say there. And yeah, it's very interesting. It's very mind-altering stuff.
But I mean, there has to be an element of truth to that, because if we were frozen in time, we would not think, we would be like, it would just be still.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We would not, in a real way, the you who is you would not be.
Right.
Right? You would cease to exist. Your body might continue to exist, but interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I've thought, I muse about the nature of time off and on. Like, I think that time is a really interesting concept, and what it means for time to exist at all, which I would argue that time is not really real. Like, it's not a thing in and of itself. It's a description of a process but his approach then is totally different than where I'd come to.
Right.
I've got to think about that.
Yeah. No, it was very, I remember when I read the line that time temporalized, he uses a lot of tautologies, by the way, and he does it intentionally. When he said that time temporalizes itself out of the future, that part really tripped me out. I was sitting there and I was like, so the moment is created out of the future, or, yeah, that actually kind of, whoa. And then I was like, well, that's profound. It kind of hit me like a wave. I was like, and to look at it as this multidimensional kind of spectrum, or this, rather than, three separate aspects as past, present, and future, but kind of the stream of being that is Dasein, that is being. That is just, that just threw me for a loop. And then furthermore, he says we're being towards wholeness, and wholeness is death. So you don't actually accomplish wholeness while you're alive. The wholeness of Dasein is a process towards being towards death. So you're in a process of ripening, constant process of ripening and
dying.
Let me see if I can find here. Let me show you. I'll read some of my notes. Death is not something that can be known literally as an experience. It is rather a phenomenological relationship that we have of being towards death. Because once you experience death, you're dead, so you can't experience death, is what he's trying to say. It is also, being toward death is always already going on. You're always being toward death. Death is the end possibility. It's the ultimate possibility, which is the end of all of Dasein's possibilities.
But now he's not speaking. So this is one of the other challenges I find, is that Because everything which you just said there, to me, operates in a Neoplatonic way, right? He's taking the concept of being, which would be an idea, and he's using the idea of death as the fulfillment of being. I think it's difficult because I try and fit it into my existing paradigm, and I need to be able to set my paradigm aside.
Right.
And that's very difficult to do.
I know. And then he writes about death and wholeness. He says, it's like the ripening of a fruit. Ripeness is already contained in unripeness.
Yes.
Wholeness is contained in incompleteness. Dasein is always moving towards a potentiality of wholeness, but does Dasein ever reach wholeness, even though wholeness is already innate in the potentiality of becoming? So there's a lot of paradoxical statements.
That's Platonic, actually. That's
right.
The Platon. No, that's Aristotelian. It's the Aristotelian theory of change.
I see.
It's the potential moving to the actual, which means that anything which comes to be existed in potential form prior to. So a green apple, which will eventually ripen and turn red, is currently green, but is always potentially red. And it actually achieves that.
So you can see he's not starting totally from scratch. He's using ideas from other people.
Interesting.
Here's another note I have. These are just my notes. Some of these are direct quotes, but some of them aren't. Here's a note I wrote. Being a being that is already understood in its possibilities for being.
Say that again. Hang on.
This is this kind of stuff he writes about.
This is what drives me nuts about him. This sort of
being a being that is already always understood in its possibilities for being.
Being a being which is already understood in its possibilities for being. That doesn't make any sense. That sentence
is a tautological mess. Yeah.
But this is what drove me nuts. I hit a morass of that kind of thing, and I was like, I got two things out of it so far. I'm calling it a day.
Well, but I think actually what he's doing is making something, I know I say it's a mess, but I think it's serving a function. He's making something so explicit. He's dragging the obvious out into the open, right? And he's doing it in a way that's actually useful. Like to say something like being bees, it seems like a ridiculous statement, but then you step back and you look at it and you're like, oh, he's trying to show us this emergent wholeness that just already always is. And so he's using tautologies to outline a conspicuous fact that is ironically inconspicuous because it's so obvious.
So fundamental.
It's so fundamental. It's like water to fish. Like I used that analogy earlier in this conversation.
Yeah.
It's always going on. So he's basically making so explicit what's always going on, And I think the function that serves is that James Hillman, a psychologist, once said, the weird paradox is what we're most aware of is what we're least aware of. So what he's trying to say is what's most obvious in its everyday capacity becomes so intrinsic to our being that it's no longer visible.
Familiarity breeds contempt.
Say that again?
I said familiarity breeds contempt.
Yeah.
If you're around something all the time, you assume that it's normal, and so you stop appreciating it properly.
Right. Yeah. So I think he's kind of pulling that move. And the other thing that's interesting that I think he's I had it on the tip of my tongue here. The other thing he emphasizes is that being essentiates as appearing.
Can you say it?
He emphasizes that being essentiates as appearing, which basically
essentiates.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So like the essence of being or the essence of experience or perception, I think what he's trying to say here is it just appears in its own wholeness as it is. So if you look at an apple, the actual experience of looking at an apple is already fully available in its meaning in that moment, whereas the Cartesian objectivist view would say that you have to break down the components of that experience into their most reductionistic aspects to understand that. But he's saying, no, it arises on its own as its own being phenomenologically. It essentiates as it appears. It makes itself available to you as a meaningful, in whatever way it's meaningful, as you perceive it immediately. And that's why he's saying we're always using different modes of attunement. And depending on what mode of attunement you're in, I think of them as psycho-emotional states. Mm-hmm. You're going to perceive your direct environment and how it essentiates and your own mind in a very directly meaningful way that cannot be broken down into reduced parts.
Okay, so here let me just, because I think I'm getting a glimmer here.
Cool.
So would you think that, so would it be that if, and this is impossible, but if you were in a void, utterly alone, with no perception of anything else, simply you and the void, would you be, in Heidegger's perspective, from Heidegger's perspective? Or is the act of engaging with the world what causes you to be?
You wouldn't be, I don't know. I can't answer this question for Heidegger, but
okay. Just based on your reading, what is your thought?
From the hip. No, you can't just be in an isolated context because there's no such thing. That context would never exist for Dasein.
And
it's a purely abstract idea.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to.
I know what you're trying to do. I'm just saying I don't know
right?
how to answer that in a meaningful way because I don't.
No, but I think your answer makes sense to me.
Yeah.
In the way that he presented his argument, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He's a weirdo.
Well, not only that, he was, let's get into some other stuff. He was strongly affiliated with the Nazi Party. And I'm not a historian on this particular subject, but I know he was not necessarily making the most societally acceptable choices in hindsight. We look at.
You mean, what do you mean by, you mean for his time or for our time?
I don't know how it was perceived and I'm sure in Germany there was different opinions, but for him to be associated with that is a controversial subject. And then for him to at the same time have valuable ideas, people have a hard time. They go back to the old ad hominem, right? They look at his character, which I think is a mistake because somebody can be a horrible person. Here I go back to value judgments, but somebody could be
using that term bad.
Yeah, I know. It's a bad habit. It's a bad habit to use the term bad.
Oh, you used it again.
It's condition. It's cultural conditioning to use good and bad. I'm working on it. No, but
an inauthentic answer would be.
It's bad from my perspective. Let's put it that from where I stand. I don't. Anyways, I'm dragging this on. But what I'm trying to say is that that's an issue that people discuss a lot is his involvement. But I do think it's ad hominem because it's like, but you can't base an idea on someone's life.
Well,
because their ideas kind of have a life of their own. And
yeah, that is definitely true. That is true. However, so going back to my idea of goodness.
Yeah.
If you truly seek goodness, it precludes certain things, right? It's not a coincidence that Nietzsche inspired Nazism.
Well, that's debatable, isn't it? Because his sister apparently edited and did some. I mean, I don't know maybe you know more of the story, but my understanding of that is that his sister published things in such a way and put them through an editing process in such a way. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. That was very much twisting Nietzsche's words.
Oh, sure, and legitimately, I believe that Nietzsche would have been pretty horrified
I don't.
with
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But it's not a coincidence, I think.
Well, tell me more. Why not?
Well, because the will to power, that whole idea it's not foreign to
power. The whole power thing is very
right.
antithetical to love in the first place, really.
Well, and really, so to go back to Heidegger, like I don't know enough about Heidegger. I didn't know he was a Nazi, but I'm not hugely surprised, right? But it would be difficult for someone like, let's pick on Thomas Aquinas, right, to be a Nazi. I'm not saying he couldn't be, but the ideas which he espoused would have made it difficult for him to do that. Whereas a lot of the philosophers from this particular branch would not have found the same barriers. But
right.
That is not to undermine what your essential point was, I think, initially, which is to disregard all his ideas by virtue of the ad hominem argument that, oh, he's a Nazi, is wrong.
Right. It's a logical fallacy.
Yeah, he's not. He could be very, very, very right and a terrible human being, right?
Yeah, he could very well have some good points, but doesn't reflect his character. But
right.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a difficult question.
Yeah, it's where does the idea leave off and the man begin? And can we be greater than our own ideals?
Yeah. It might also be possible to have a kind of love affair with this certain place in your imagination where you go to your study, and imagine Heidegger goes to his study and writes a book, and he's really, he's in this ecstatic place of attunement to something interesting, but then he goes back to his life where he's an incredibly rigid and closed off person. I mean, that's a possibility, right? Like,
very possible. Yes.
You can have like a creative outlet where you're very prolific. You'd be a great musician, for example, and then you go back to your normal life and you're totally different.
Yes. Yeah. And
philosophy is a kind of music, right? It's a way of harmonizing ideas. It's a creative pursuit. It's not the same as music.
That philosophy is the root of all things.
Right.
In the human experience, philosophy is the root, right?
Right.
But my wife would disagree.
Really?
Yeah. But she worked, when her graduate work, she wrote some very interesting papers on the music that came out of Germany leading into Nazism. Some of the best musicians in the world were Nazis, right?
Right.
And so that kind of goes to the point that you're making, which is that these are not mutually exclusive things, and to pretend that there is nothing beautiful coming out of it is not quite true.
Yes.
It's just really complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
The relationship of beauty to moral goodness is not one-to-one.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And the whole question of moral goodness is one that I think we're far from having a solid answer to that everybody can agree on. Where does that come from?
But I don't think our job is to get everyone to agree on it. I think our job is to try and come as far as we personally can.
Yes.
Right? And that goes back to my idea of what is the fulfillment of a human life.
Yeah.
So just to put a plug in.
Right. No, I love it. And the thing that you said at the beginning of our conversation about you were stressed and then you decided just to stop being stressed. Like how do you, let's go back. How do you do that?
I just do it. I
want to get into that. I think that's important.
I'm not a normal person, right?
Nobody's
so I know that most people are more at the whim of their emotions than I am. I'm very, very cerebrally distant, let's say. And so when I experience something, like so Dyson, to go back to that idea, of me being me in the moment, I am always, not always, but most of the time, I am aware of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I am watching myself do what I do. And I have the ability, not always, but often, to tell myself that these things are not important and I don't need to let them affect me. And I just don't. It's mystical. It's magical. I don't know. I don't have an answer for it. But I guess trying to think through my experience of it, what I would say is once I realize something to be true, I just commit myself to that truth, right? And the truth is that I'd forgotten that other people have literally no control over me. They can't dictate what I do at all unless I let them. And losing sight of that was leading me to be really, really anxious about my inability to control other people. But that moment of realization of the essential truth, which is that you're you, you're gonna do you. I can try and persuade you, and I will, but your freedom is to do what you think is right. And my freedom is to do what I think is right. And so just knowing that lets me let all the other stuff run off like water from a duck.
That's great. So it's a very cognitive process for you. It's
for me, it is. Yeah.
You top to bottom. You think your way out of a feeling.
I do. And that's cool. That's not a normal thing.
Well, some people do that though. Some people are very good at doing that. Some people have to move more. You know, they have to go for a run. They have to meditate. They have to be more somatic or use feelings more to process and cope. But everybody has different ways of coping. I really like that. That's cool.
Well, and it's worth mentioning that I can't do that with fear. I can do it with many emotions.
Stress, anxiety.
Stress is relatively easy, but fear, like true fear, like heart pounding, heart palpitating fear,
right,
going way beyond anxiety, I cannot just turn off.
Right.
Which means I'm not perfect by a long shot.
Well, yeah, nobody's above affect, right?
Right. Well, but the way I was describing it made me sound a little bit more like a robot. Like I could just overwrite my emotional programming, which I'm trying to say I can't.
What I got out of it is you do get stressed.
I do, yes.
Right. So human, yes. check the human box, and then yes. You have a way of dealing with that. But that's interesting because if you look at it from a neuroscience perspective, that your prefrontal cortex is essentially regulating your limbic system when you're doing that. You're using that cerebral process of, okay, what's really going on here? And that's somehow calming down that midbrain and that, that highly triggered state that you're in. So it's a really cool piece of anecdotal data there.
Yes.
Yeah. That's amazing. But yeah, fear would make sense because that's a much stronger, packs more of a punch, for the nervous system. It's like, pay attention to me right now,
Yeah. The reason why I know that is I had to fix my chimney this summer.
Yeah.
And I am personally afraid of heights, like
right.
profoundly afraid of heights.
Right.
And I could not turn that off. I tried. Like rationally, I could say, look, a fall from this height won't kill me.
Yeah.
But that had no effect. It was.
Yeah. Well, some things are just so strong that they're just totally out of our control sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, I could make my peace with it. I fixed the chimney, right?
Right.
But it was not something I could just flip a switch on.
You
like
can't
I
just
could with
change
stress.
your experience completely.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting where everybody has a different line, right? Where it's like, what do I have power over in my direct experience and what do I not? And then how do I cope with that? How do I take responsibility? Because I'm responsible for my emotions, my actions, how I respond. And eventually you could say, I'm just not going to go on roofs anymore. That's one way, right? That's one way of taking personal responsibility. Like I told you at the beginning of this conversation, I'm not going to check the comments because I have a hard time regulating my nervous system because of my, I think it's a genetic proclivity combined with life experience that I have stronger sensitivity about that. And why expose myself when I have a great community of friends and people from my audience who I can talk to privately?
Yeah.
That's a choice. I'm making a choice not to expose myself, not to get on the roof. I'm not getting on the roof in that particular circumstance.
This comes back to this sort of, I for many, many years, I've had this idea that I'm almost impossible to insult, because in order to insult me, you'd have to try and hurt me. And if you're trying to hurt me, I don't respect you. And if I don't respect you, then I don't care what you think.
So that's logical, very logical way of processing feelings. That's so interesting to me.
This is my experience of the world. I'm a very strange individual.
Yeah, well, you have an uncanny ability to think your way out of triggers.
But not out of Heidegger, so...
Right. But somehow that soothes you, it sounds like. It's like, yes. Oh, I don't have to worry. Your body listens.
I don't have to allow this to affect me right now.
Right. See, I use that to good critical thinking to regulate, and I also have to meditate. I have to calm my mind, and then I have to also cultivate love. It's not enough for me to just say, "Oh, don't worry, that's bullshit." Right? I have to say, "Don't worry, that's bullshit," and like, there's this love thing inside of me that can also be a part of my experience, that I can take care of myself rather than needing to rely on whatever I'm getting out of this experience to validate me, right?
Yeah, but that's goodness, right?
Right.
That's what I would say, that the acknowledgement that ultimately it's good, right? And
right.
Goodness is what you're reaching for, and ultimately it's going to be okay, and love is goodness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so people sometimes wonder, well, how I find the positive in so many things. And my answer is, well, it's because it's there, right?
Right.
Negative things aren't real most of the time. They're the absence of a good thing.
Right.
You have to define things in terms of positivity, because that's just the truth. You don't define mathematics in terms of the number 0. You use the number 1.
Yeah. See, I differ a little bit there, I think, because and feel free to let me know when you need to get going. I know you got.
I'm coming close. I hear people making dinner, but
okay, we'll wrap up here in a minute. But just something to bookmark here for me. See, the proactive urge to do harm is its own thing. It's not that it's the absence of good. To me, it's just its own energy. It's its own phenomena. It's its own, let's take the serial killer again. Like it just is. It's just, that's what that thing is. That's what it's doing.
Shiva, the destroyer.
Yeah. It's just a part of, the black hole swallows the stars sometimes. It's not because it's, the absence of something light. It just does what it does. That's just at least my way. Like, it's more, my way of thinking is more proactive. Like, everything is proactive. It's like I'm proactively trying to do things that are quote unquote what you call good, or I'm proactively going after something that is getting another affective need met in another way. I mean, if you look at like serial killers, who, like, if you look at their brain scans, you look at some of the genetic studies, I mean, they really want to do that.
Yeah.
They like it. They enjoy it. It's like, relatively speaking, it's good for them, from their perspective, not the good, not the way you're defining good.
Yes. We definitely, you should write this down, because this is a really, really interesting concept in, let's call it relativistic ethics.
Yeah.
Right? Because I would say that the serial killer is doing the good that he knows, or she knows, right? And it is a very, very small, low, and tiny good, but there is some good in it for the serial killer, at least, because there's a sense of pleasure, and pleasure is good, right?
Sure.
It's not devoid of all goodness, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's hard to have the words
terrible,
come out of your
terrible
mouth.
analogy.
Yeah.
I don't know why you keep bringing these people up.
I mean, I don't want to be on, I don't want to be the next person who's canceled on CNN, but,
no glorification of serial killers, please.
Right. No, we're not glorifying I'm just being a smartass. We're not glorifying anything. But yeah, we're on the same, again, semantics. We're saying the same thing then.
I think so too, yeah.
Yeah, it's just, to me, it comes back to everything is proactive. It's not reactive. It's not, everything is going after, everything has its own, what Heidegger calls mode of attunement, or I like to call them subpersonalities. Everything has at the core of its activity, there's a perspective and there's a goal. There's a telos. There is and it gets a need met, right?
You mean
people. So an
end in mind. When you say telos, you mean like teleology, like
it's going for something. It's trying to get something met, right? Like, so usually, and this is what one of my mentors in psychology always says is human beings do exactly what they want to do in any given moment, and then they make up a story as to why they did it.
There's something to that.
I think oftentimes, and I'll let you go here, we get convoluted in psychology because I would if I could, but I can't because, or I did it because, or, we punish a kid when they, do something. Why'd you do that? They're supposed to come up with a salient reason.
Have you ever listened to System of a Down?
Most of the time, I just wanted to do it.
Have you listened to System of a Down?
No.
There's this great lyric. You should. I think it's Toxicity, but it's why did you? And I can't remember what it is. Why'd you put the chair up on the wall or something? And it's because you wanted to.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And that's why'd you leave the keys up on the table? You wanted to, right?
Right.
You do those things because you want to. Yes.
Right.
But I should go.
I gotta go.
People are waiting, and I've got little kids who are gonna, storm the doors of my castle. So
awesome.